Welcome to the Lab to Cart podcast, where we explore the intersection of AI and the future of shopping. Our goal is to educate and inspire listeners about the potential of AI in the e-commerce, retail, and D2C sectors. I'm your host, Jimmy Slagle, and let's not wait and get into the podcast. What is going on, everyone? Thank you, Lindsey, for coming on the show. Round two. The first episode was absolutely great, but unfortunately, it did not save. So now we get to have another really fun conversation. But Lindsey, if you wouldn't mind, just give everyone the background of who you are and what you do.
Sure. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me onto the podcast. Okay, background on me. I think my claim to fame is that I worked at TikTok for 5 years. I actually studied Chinese in college and moved over to China sort of in a circumlocutor way a few years after graduating and found out about this tech company called ByteDance. So I joined ByteDance, which is the TikTok parent company in China, in Shanghai, and proceeded to help them as they globalized and built TikTok in the US. And so when I first joined on, really my remit was helping build out our English facing presence, both in office and also online. And so I was overseeing our employer brand in the US and then in some of our other regions, and really was focused on building, no one in the US had really heard about TikTok, right? Like it was still very much, I would come over on work trips and I would tell people that I worked at TikTok. And occasionally it's like the pizza, the guy at the pizza store would be like, oh, that's that app. Like my cousin is on that app, right? So it was very much that like, oh yeah, I think I've heard of that. So what we were tasked to do is like, how do we actually get people excited, get top talent excited about working at TikTok when they really didn't know what it was, and when there was a lot of sort of more, potentially more well-known, more appealing tech companies that people premium tech talent might want to work for. And so we did a lot of work building out our LinkedIn. We built our LinkedIn from 0 to 1 million, really through strong community building on the platform, and a really good content strategy. And then, we built out the community and the culture internally at TikTok. We had a very strong internal culture, very strong internal programming. And I think that to this day, a lot of people, their favorite thing about TikTok is the people who work there. And I do think that TikTok brings in a really awesome person. So I'd like to think that some of that helped with that. And then I moved on and I started working with venture-backed companies on helping them work with their portfolio companies to use TikTok as a platform to scale. I really believe, and we already are seeing it, right? Like the next generation of consumer brands are being built on and for TikTok, for the For You page rather than the Instagram feed, for video first rather than to be posted photo first, right? And then another thing that another difference is like that relatability factor, right? So seeing brands that are really relatable, that are really transparent, that's the kind of stuff that you see on TikTok versus Instagram, where it's more, it's glossier, it's more your best self. So, or the fancy side of your product. So started working with venture capital firms, their portfolio companies on doing that. And I since left TikTok after an awesome, almost 5-year stint to start my own consulting company.
I love it. So I'm curious, when you first joined ByteDance, how many users were on TikTok? If you know this, how many users were on TikTok in the US when you joined and then when you left?
That's a really great question. And I actually don't know the answer, though we did cross 1 billion while I was there. So we crossed 1 billion MAU. I mean, a ton of different milestones while I was there. What I can say to give perspective on the growth and the proportion of the growth was that when I started, there was about 20 people in the US. And then when I left, we had over 5,000. So, and I might have even been like over 10, like the scale and the rate of change was immense. And actually 5,000 is inaccurate because by the time that I left, we had 2,000 people in the Austin office alone. So I actually moved to open the Austin office, was the first employee. So we went from 1 to 2,000 there. So it must have been about 10K by the time that I left, at TikTok overall. So then proportionately with users, right, you can sort of extrapolate what that might have been.
It's so crazy. That's wild. And you are, regarded as someone that really understands TikTok, how to make TikTok content, especially starting to build like this organic sort of community.
Mhm.
And as we have talked about in the past, that is such an important part of any startup is how can you build this following of people that just love your brand and who you are.
Mhm.
Um, We've talked about it before. It's only going to get easier to build e-commerce companies because of
Mhm.
all the advancements in AI. But what's going to be more and more difficult are building those tight-knit communities. And so I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. Like, what advice do you have for a lot of these e-commerce D2C brands that are thinking about how can we start to build this community of people that are those loyal supporters of the brand,
Yeah.
especially at the early days when you have this product, you have this idea, and you're really trying to grow. I mean, even on top of that, it's still interesting to me that even brands that are very, very successful in revenue wise haven't been able to crack the code of TikTok.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, like what is it that makes or breaks the ability to build that community, especially on a platform like TikTok?
Yeah, so I think it starts with hyperspecificity, and that's really what TikTok gave rise to, right? The algorithm on TikTok creates an environment where hyper-specific content can thrive. So when TikTok first started, we would talk about these different talks, right? Like these different sub communities that you can get into. One of the most well-known ones, for example, is book talk, right? There's also money talk. I'm sure there's like a home reno talk. So there's all, now that, as you said, like it's becoming easier and easier to start an e-commerce company. It's becoming the barriers to entry are lower and lower as more technology comes out, as more information comes out. I think the differentiating factor in starting really successful, really sticky e-commerce companies is going to be how hyper specific they are and how tapped into specific communities they are, right? So let's use the book talk example. Um, there is a rabid, there's a very engaged community around books on TikTok. So when you think of a brand that's trying to build up a following within that community, the more they understand their audience and they're able to really tap into that community, the more sticky they're going to be, the better community they're going to have. And I think the long term, the more they're going to be able to have success selling into that community. The challenge I think there becomes how do you what does it look like when these kind of brands are trying to transcend a very specific community and then become, a larger, a bigger brand with more mass appeal. And I think that's one of the challenges. But I think to start, the brands that are going to be really successful are the brands that are going to be able to really tap into these subcultures and successfully build community. I think it's a little bit different when you're looking at like a CPG product, which focuses often more on mass appeal. But even when thinking about like the CPG category, there are so many, subcategories of concerns and interests that different products can tap into and really understand and learn, and not only sell to those audiences, but become like a true resource to those audiences, on either like how to improve their lifestyle, even if it's a clothing brand, right? Like how to, be more of the kind of person that you want to be.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's really good. It's one of those things where I don't think people realize how powerful the TikTok algorithm is,
Mhm.
where you can literally get down to if you are a male that lives in Minnesota and likes to do X, TikTok is going to show males in Minnesota that like to do X's video.
Yeah,
And odds are there's a big enough sub community of that type of people where you know, it's going to start to at least build that snowball effect of like you get this community to really buy into it, and then you can start to expand slowly out. And so, yeah, when you say hyper specificity, like that is extreme hyper specificity. Like
it's
don't
such a hard word to
disregard
say.
don't disregard the hyper part because
Mhm.
TikTok is incredible at showing the exact right people who's going to want to watch this.
100%. And it's funny. And I think sometimes one of the differences when you come onto a platform like TikTok versus onto a platform like Instagram is sometimes on TikTok, you don't actually know who your audience is yet. Whereas on Instagram, and this is on the ads perspective as well. So you know, you didn't ask me about this, but and I'm sure you're familiar with this in all the work that you do on your ads. But when you're running ads on TikTok, it's generally advised to start very broad with your targeting, right? Because you know, at TikTok, we say you don't necessarily know yet who's going to be interested in your product. We will help you find that person. Versus on Instagram, it's like, no, tell us exactly who that person who's interested in your product is, and we'll and then we can find it, right? Whereas or TikTok's like, let's find it sort of together. And it's just making me think of I get content. I've gotten content recently about ADHD. And I'm like, am I getting diagnosed on TikTok for, has TikTok found me and it's diagnosing me as being someone with ADHD, right? It's like, you don't always know who your audience is on TikTok, and TikTok will often find it for you.
Yeah, yeah. So, I'm very curious to get your thoughts on this. Um, Community building has always been something that is, one of our human instincts. We like to find our group of people, just from the psychological
Mhm.
perspective. And I think is going to play some factor in it. I don't know if it's going to help or hurt,
Mhm.
and I'm really curious to get your thoughts on it. But like even there are companies, and we just had Lisa on, the founder of Sienna AI, last week, of where she's building this AI tool that's an empathetic customer support person. So if you're dealing with customer support on the website, it's going to make their tool seems like you're communicating with a human, but in reality it's AI. And so I'm curious to just get your thoughts. Like, how do you think AI is really going to impact building communities, whether it be in more of the positive, or the negative side of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, you know, I don't know the answer yet. I think that it somewhat depends. Like when I think about this question, the first thing that I think about is generations, right? So I think the way in which AI could be used to community build for Gen Alpha is different than the way that AI could be used to build communities for a millennial, right? Like let's use those as the two sort of the two bookmarks. I think you're going to find in a millennial audience a lot more resistance to AI built community engagement, right? I think you're going to find from millennials that they want more human experiences, and that they are resistant to AI generated community building, relationship building, right? Like a millennial is unlikely to be your audience for, you know, like a friend chatbot, let's say, for example. I think Gen Z is kind of that middle of the road, or is that in between group where you're going to see some resistance, some acceptance, and there's going to be like more tension in that generation. And then I think Gen Alpha, you know, they're the generation that's kind of born into the iPad, right? So I think you're going to see more interest in that, more comfortability in that, in working in developing relationships, having community that's driven in sort of a digitally first way. I think for that generation, then there'll still be sort of a premium on like very human experiences. But I do think that you'll see that there is more opportunity to build sort of digitally first type community relationship building with that generation than there is for older generations right now, right? If you're like a brand, an e-commerce brand trying to build community, trying to use technology, trying to use AI to do it, I think the thing that I think about is like, how can you leverage technology to build a culture of sharing, like a culture of sharing your product? I don't know that AI yet is the solution for that. Like, I think there are probably more of a, infrastructural or like a connective tissue and less of a consumer facing thing, right? So like the way that I would see it now is it's an AI product that can create really unique experiences for the community. And it isn't necessarily like the chatbot. You know, I think I actually love the idea of an empathetic customer service chatbot because we all know, not that customer service people aren't empathetic, but we all know we need more help on customer service and it's not always designed to help you. But I think so I think that using like putting that example aside, I think for truly social experiences, I don't think that AI right now is a solution for consumer facing social experiences. I think that it's a solution for connective tissue experiences. And I think that can be very hard. Often those experiences can be hard to connect, right? It's hard to connect a digital experience to an in-person experience, or even an experience from one platform to another, or an experience that connects one, brand loyalist to another brand loyalist. And I think that that's potentially where AI could play a role in developing, more cohesive, more engaged, and more vibrant communities.
Totally. I mean, to our point earlier, people don't realize, but TikTok's algorithm is AI, and so
Mhm.
it pulls people in together to this community without people even realizing that it is AI. And so even tying it
Completely.
to our conversation, it's like I think AI has already done or helped us move forward in the sense of finding our communities because it was the first platform where you just started to watch content, not that from accounts that you followed, but from what you're interested in subconsciously or consciously.
A thousand
And
percent. Yeah.
yeah, and so I think that's been something that's probably started to be ingrained in us before. Like it wasn't like you had to join a Facebook group. It was
No.
TikTok kind of brought everyone in that group together.
And I think that's, when that's such an interesting call out, right? And we didn't really talk about this when I was talking about my experience at TikTok. But one of the things when we were going out with TikTok in the US and globally, and we never, TikTok, part of TikTok's branding, part of its value proposition to its users has never been that it's an AI company or that it's a machine learning company, right? We never actually even talked about that. We like specifically would not talk about. And we can get into various reasons why, but I think from a user experience, that what that created is that when you got onto the app, you didn't have any expectation, right? You just kind of knew that it was going to give you content that you loved or that you thought was cool, and then you had this experience of being like, oh my god, this is crazy. It like, how did it figure out that I might have ADHD, right? How did it figure out that I was this guy in Fargo, and now it's giving me other content from guys in Fargo, right? And that was like, that sparks joy, right? So when we're talking about AI experiences that spark joy and are like connective tissue to connect you to other people, I think TikTok is one of the most, to your point, like it's an incredible example of that, that we don't often even realize is.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree 100%. One thing that I think is really interesting about how communities can start as well is through, call it influencers, or just people that we view
Mhm.
with this high standard. Like, for example, Cuts Clothing is one of my favorite
Mhm.
brands, and part of my inspiration behind it is like their tagline is the sport of business, and I love sports, I love business,
I
and so they're
love it.
yeah, they're creating clothes for kind of the sport of business,
I
and
can
they
feel
have a
that
lot
being
of
exciting.
athletes. They have a lot of athletes that represent and wear their clothes, and so naturally, I'm like, okay, well, I want to be like Patrick Mahomes or Travis Kelce or whoever, so I want to wear
Yeah.
cuts. Um, the rise of AI influencers to me is going to be such an interesting development over the
Mhm.
next couple years, and you are someone that has started to really dive into different generations and how that's going to be unfolding over time and how Gen Alpha is going to react to this versus millennials.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, do you think that we are going to be able to get to a point at which young people like Gen Alpha views these AI influencers as in high regard, similar to like how I view an athlete that I really like,
Mhm.
or because to me that, and I'm 25, it's not like I'm old,
Mhm.
but that even seems like a crazy concept.
Stretch.
So I'm curious, like, do you think that AI influencers are going to be this thing where young people really look up to them and start to have almost that like cult like following? And is there anything? This is a loaded question, so you can
Mhm.
dive. But is there anything that D2C e-commerce brands should start to think about when it comes to, like, should I start to think about AI influencers or should I work with AI
Yeah.
influencers, or any of that?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So the first thing that I'm thinking about, like thinking about this generationally and sort of how I feel like we've seen influencers progress and even shifts that I'm seeing now. I think the biggest shift that I'm seeing now from an influencer perspective, and this is no new news, but it's, we big influencers are now being replaced with these smaller influencers. and that relatability factor for people of the influencer who maybe lives in your same hometown or your same town and your same city and has 50,000, followers rather than a million followers, right? I think there's much more interest right now in the influencer who has 50,000 followers than the influencer who has a million. And that's because the 50,000 follower influencer, you feel like you could be friends with, right? You can almost develop this like parasocial friendship in the way people talk about people, Swifties having parasocial relationships with Taylor Swift. But, there's quite a big distance, right, between them and Taylor Swift, most likely. Where some of these influencers, who have 50,000, the distance is not so wide, right? So there's like that high relatability factor. And I think especially in that sort of like Zillennial Gen Z category, I see more interest. And I think older, millennials as well are becoming more interested in like these smaller influencers, but definitely see that with like Gen Z, Zillennials, the rise and the hype around these sort of mid-size, even small influencers. And then thinking through sort of these AI-driven influencers, I do think that there's a world in which AI influencers will have a big opportunity to grow, right? We already see some. I think when you often see the ones that you see now, they're very photo driven. It's like there's like this surrealness around them. It's primarily photos. But I think as you start thinking through what are stories that you can build behind these individuals, behind these AI influencers, like I'm thinking in Japan, there's a whole band, right? That's like an AI generated band, right? There's like lyrics and songs and content all behind this band, and thinking through the future of what AI influencers could look like. It's not so far of a stretch when you think going back to book talk, right? When you think about how people develop affinity for book characters. And you see a lot of that on TikTok where they continue to move from the book and into the digital space, continuing to build out, talk about, and expand on the character from a book. I think that having an AI influencer is not very far step from that. And when you think about, again, like a Gen Alpha, I think that they are going to be much more interested in sort of this world where digital blends with real. So where you've got like the surreal, the fantasy, the digital that blends with the human. And so I think that will Gen Alphas. And I do think that you will see these kind of potentially character driven AI influencers or AI influencers that have strong characters, that have strong backstories, that are very successful. And so then thinking about how a brand can leverage that, yeah, I think absolutely. Like you already see the success of different brands doing placements in Roblox and things like that, right? So there's obviously reception to it. It's like, again, like having those human tangible products be brought into the digital world that I think is interesting to people. And so I think the same goes for brands trying to place product on an AI influencer. And then even like, I think you could see a world in which brands are created with a digital influencer being the foundation of the brand, being the foundation for the product. So I think, especially if you're looking for a way to differentiate as a D2C product, I think it's very interesting. And I do think there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's even just the story of being able to say we worked with an AI influencer, here were the results.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm sure everyone is going to be very curious. Like that's a great, concept in and of itself. And so yeah, it's fascinating. And it even starts to get to the point of like, could someone's TikTok account just be run where it's an AI, you know, influencer, if you will, or just
Yeah.
an AI avatar that looks realistic and human, that's making all the content or thinking of all the ideas. Like we're going to be getting to a stage where some people are starting to adopt that sooner than later, which is going to be just again really interesting to see unfold. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like I think these young kids are just going to like it's going to become second nature to them. They're not going to think anything of it if there's an AI influencer versus like a real person influencer.
Yeah, like, because I think for a millennial or someone who's a little bit older, that they would probably always approach that with a sort of oddity, like, oh, I'm looking at this because I think it's sort of odd or unusual or strange, less in a way where they're like less in a way where that's somehow like resonating with them. But I think, yeah, when you're thinking about a younger generation, I think there is going to be, one of the things that I'm thinking about right now is how the Gen Alpha is going to be an increasingly private, they say that Gen Alpha is going to be an increasingly private generation. They're a generation that grew up with cameras in their face, like a lot of, you've got a lot of young children who are sort of, or who are sort of becoming influencers as like family influencers and child influencers and things like that. And so I think there's some people who are, predicting that you're going to see a backlash where you're going to have Gen Alpha not be as interested. Have that if you have a generation that is resistant to sharing their more intimate personal moments, then you could also have a generation that's more interested in seeing content that's not talking about other people's intimate moments, right? But rather it's AI generated. Like you could see a world where that would be more interesting to them because because it sort of respects that privacy. So I think that's another reason potentially too why there could be interest in that generation that's a little bit different than the interest or the fascination that a millennial might have with that.
Yeah, yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I'm really excited to see how it's all going to unfold, because it is just like you can really get to the dystopian sort of world pretty quickly when you go down that rabbit hole. But like even think about Snapchat AI or
Yeah.
my AI on Snapchat, where it's like kids are spending most of the time. That's how most young kids communicate with their
Mhm.
friends is through Snapchat. And so if it's just this other or this next person, and if that ever just becomes standardized, then arguably they're going to be communicating with this AI bot as much as they would with their friends because it's just right there for them. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's especially I think kind of tying this together. If your audience is younger people that are up and coming, it's very
Consumers.
important to just know how their consumerism habits are going to be different than call it the millennials or Gen Z, and even the content that they like and all of that. So it's very fascinating. So Lindsay, I got one last question for you. Um, I always love to end with this question. If there's one thing that you wish that more brands, consumer facing brands in general, knew about AI or how AI is going to impact us, or just kind of like your one liner kind of take or stance on AI as it stands today, what would you recommend to a lot of these consumer facing brands? And that can be around building a community, that could just be like use ChatGPT more. You can keep
Yeah.
it as specific or broad as you want, but what's that one thing that you would recommend to consumer brands when it comes to AI?
Yeah, I think echoing the sort of the conversation that we've had to date, as a consumer brand, I would be thinking about AI and how I'm going to integrate AI into my business and my consumer facing business as how can I use AI to spark joy for my audience and for my customer. And I think because I think that that's the unique opportunity that AI presents is like creating these really special moments. And I think sometimes that gets lost in sort of the hype around AI is like what good working AI really does is it creates these moments where you're like, oh my God, that worked so well, or oh my gosh, I can't believe it figured that out, right? And that's what you want AI to create for your customer in their experience with your brand. So when selecting AI products or thinking about how I want to integrate AI into my strategy, I would be thinking about how can AI spark joy for my customer.
Yeah, and the great thing is like often that used to be something where you had to manually do it, and it was
Mhm.
hard to scale. Like your
Yeah.
differentiator was I have to do things that don't scale and
Mhm.
take time to write a handwritten note.
Yeah.
Now
It's
it's
the
like
handwritten note.
yeah, AI is able to like do the things that previously you couldn't do at scale now, which I think
Yeah.
is going to be super helpful for all consumer facing brands.
Yeah. And it's like no longer the handwritten note, but what is it now, right? Not the
Yeah.
handwritten note, but something else.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for coming on the show. Appreciate the insights. I'm glad we were able to get this one. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having me.